Okay, so today we're going to deep dive into generative AI.
Generative AI.
Yeah.
GenAI.
GenAI, I like
Go
that.
fetchy.
Yeah, and this is something that I think a lot of people are talking about now. And, we talk a lot on this show about, just the flood of information that's coming at everybody these days. And this kind of takes that even a step further.
It really does.
So instead of just sorting through and finding information, now we're talking about technology that can actually create new content.
Right.
And that could be anything from text that sounds like a human wrote it.
Oh, yeah.
To images, to videos, and even computer code.
It is pretty amazing.
Yeah, so this is something that's really moving fast, and it's getting easier and easier for people to use.
And it is moving fast.
Right.
That's one of the things that's so remarkable about this.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at a recent publication that came out from UNESCO to try to make sense of all this.
Right, and it's specifically focused on what this means for the future of education and research.
Yeah, 2023 they put this out, and it's really interesting because they're trying to give guidelines, to countries and institutions all over the world.
Global guidance?
Yeah, about, what they can do right now to kind of get ready for this. And then also, what are the bigger long-term strategies?
Yeah, immediate actions and long-term policies.
Yeah, to make sure that, this technology is used in a way that's,
that benefits everybody.
Yeah, that benefits humanity.
Right. A human-centered vision for AI.
And that's a perfect segue to talk about UNESCO a little bit more. They're the UN's Agency for Education, and they have a very strong belief in education as a human right for everyone.
Absolutely, a fundamental right.
Yeah, and they're all about, using education to create peace and, sustainable development all over the world.
Global peace and sustainable development through education.
Yeah, and so when UNESCO comes out with something like this and says hey, this is important,
The big deal.
we should pay attention.
Right, we really should.
So in this deep dive, we're going to, break down what's in these guidelines.
Unpack them.
Yeah, and figure out what it means for, how we learn, how we teach, and what the future of education is going to look like in, this digital world.
This increasingly digital world that's changing so rapidly.
Yeah. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is generative AI?
Well, generative AI, it's a type of artificial intelligence.
Okay.
And it can make new content all on its own.
Okay.
So think text images, videos, music, even computer programs.
Wow.
And it does all this based on what you tell it.
Oh, so I could say...
Just by using natural language prompts?
I could say, write me a poem about a cat.
Exactly.
And it would do it.
It would try to write you a poem about a cat.
That's wild. And how does it do that? How does it know how to create all these different things?
Well, it learns by going through huge amounts of data.
All right.
Think of almost all the stuff that's online.
Wow.
Publicly available information. It figures out patterns in all that data, like how words usually go together or what kind of visuals are usually next to each other. And then it uses those patterns to make something new.
So it's not just copying what's already out there. It's actually making something totally new.
Right. It's really generating novel content.
So it's more like a factory than a library.
Exactly. A factory for ideas.
I like that. So what's going on under the hood? What's the tech that's making all this possible?
Well, the heart of it is machine learning, which is a type of AI that lets computers get better with practice, basically.
Okay.
The more data they crunch, the better they get. And for generative AI, a lot of that is based on artificial neural networks.
ANNs.
ANNs, exactly. They're these super complicated systems that kind of work like the human brain with lots of connections.
Okay.
And there are different types of ANNs. The ones that are driving GenAI are particularly interesting.
So when it comes to creating text and images, are there different types of ANNs that are being used?
Yeah, there are. So when we're talking about generating text, the big breakthroughs have come from what are called general-purpose transformers.
Okay. And these led to the development of large language models, or LLMs, as they're often called.
LLMs.
Yes. And you've probably heard of GPT, Generative Pre-trained Transformer.
Yeah, GPT.
That's a good example.
I've heard of that.
Those are the models that OpenAI has developed, and ChatGPT is kind of the poster child for what these can do.
Yeah, ChatGPT, right? That's the one everyone's talking about. And I know UNESCO's report talks about how these GPTs have, rapidly evolved.
Oh, they have. It's been remarkable.
Can you kind of walk us through that? How have they gotten so much better so quickly?
Sure. So the report actually breaks down some numbers, and it's pretty fascinating.
Oh, okay.
So GPT-1, which came out in 2018, was trained on 40 gigabytes of text data.
Okay.
And it had 117 million parameters.
Parameters, what are those?
So think of parameters like the little knobs and dials inside the model that can be adjusted.
Okay.
And they determine how the model processes information.
Got it.
So GPT-1 could do some basic language stuff, but it was pretty limited. Then just a year later, GPT-2 came out.
Still used about the same amount of data, 40 gilobits, but the number of parameters jumped up to 1.5 billion.
Wow.
So that meant it could generate much more coherent text that actually made sense in context.
Okay.
It could translate languages, summarize stuff, and even write different kinds of creative content.
Oh, wow.
Then GPT-3 came along in 2020, and this was a huge leap forward.
It's huge.
Yeah. It was trained on 17,000 gilobits of data.
17,000.
Yeah, a massive jump.
Wow.
And it had 175 billion parameters.
Okay, so we're talking like exponential growth here.
Right, and that allowed it to do things like write articles that sounded like a human wrote them, and even adapt to different writing styles just by giving it a few examples.
That is incredible.
It really is.
Okay, so then what about GPT-4?
So GPT-4, which came out in 2023, they're a little more secretive about the exact numbers,
Oh.
but it's estimated to have been trained on over 1 million GBBs of data.
1 million.
And something like 170 trillion parameters.
Wow, so they went from billions to trillions.
Yeah, the scale is mind-blowing.
That is really hard to wrap my head around.
I know, and this massive increase means it's much better at following instructions, and it's also much more reliable. It makes fewer mistakes, and it can handle much more complex tasks.
So basically, the more data they feed it, the more parameters it has, the smarter it gets.
That's the general idea.
Okay, so that's text generation.
Yeah.
What about creating images? How does that work?
So for images, they often use different approaches like generative adversarial networks or GANs, and also diffusion models.
Okay, I've heard of GANs, but I don't really know how they work.
So it's kind of like a competition between two neural networks, a generator and a discriminator.
Okay,
So you give the generator like a prompt. Let's say you want a picture of a cat wearing a hat.
okay,
The generator tries to make that image,
okay.
but it's just starting out, so the image might be kind of weird.
I can imagine.
Then the discriminator looks at that image and tries to decide, is this a real photo or did the generator make it?
Oh, interesting.
So if the discriminator can tell it's fake, the generator has to try again, and it keeps doing this back and forth millions of times.
Wow.
Until the generator is making images that are so good, the discriminator can't tell they're fake.
So they're kind of like battling it out to make the best possible image.
That's a good way to put it.
Wow, that's really cool. Okay, you mentioned earlier that ChatGPT was kind of a big deal because it was free and easy to use.
Yes, it was a game changer in terms of accessibility.
Why was that so important?
Well, before ChatGPT, this kind of GPT technology was mostly being used by like researchers and developers,
Yeah.
people who knew how to code and work with these complex systems.
Yeah.
But ChatGPT put it right in everyone's hands.
Yeah, just like in a web browser.
Yeah, anyone with an internet connection could suddenly start using it, and that's what really caught the public's attention and got everyone excited about the possibilities.
Yeah, it definitely got people's attention. And then pretty soon, there were all these other options popping up, too.
Oh yeah, by the time UNESCO put out this report, they were already listing a bunch of alternatives.
Like what?
Like Alpaca Bard, ChatSonic, Ernie Hugging Chat, Jasper Llama, Open Assistant, Tongi Kuan when you chat.
Wow, that's a lot.
And they all have their own little quirks, like some are better at certain things or they use slightly different approaches.
And it seems like they're not just standalone apps anymore. They're being built into all kinds of other things.
Oh yeah, that's a big trend. We're seeing LLMs being integrated into tools like ChatPDF, which can summarize and analyze documents. There's Elicit for research and perplexity, which is like an AI-powered search engine.
Wow, so it's everywhere.
Pretty much. And you're even seeing them built into web browsers and things like Microsoft Word and Excel.
So this isn't just a fad. It's here to stay.
I think it's safe to say that, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about some other terms that UNESCO mentions in the report. Foundation models and EdGPT. What are those all about?
So foundation model is a term that's been used by some researchers to describe these large general purpose models like GPT. They're kind of like a base that you can build on and adapt for different tasks.
Oh, okay, so it's like a starting point.
Exactly. And then EdGPT is basically a foundation model that's been specifically trained for education.
Oh, so it was like tailored for the classroom.
Yeah, they use huge data sets of educational materials to train it.
Okay.
So you end up with an AI that's better at things like answering student questions or helping with specific subjects.
So like EduChat and Math GPT that the report talks about?
Exactly. Those are good examples of EdGPT models.
Okay, so it's like taking the power of something like ChatGPT and then fine-tuning it for education.
Precisely. That's the idea.
Okay, so we've been throwing around a lot of terms. Let's talk about prompt engineering for a minute, because it sounds like getting these AIs to do what you want is a bit more complicated than just, asking a question.
It can be, yes.
So what's the deal with prompt engineering?
Well, with simple prompts, you can get pretty basic responses.
Okay.
But if you want to really unlock the power of GenAI, especially for more complex tasks or creative stuff, it takes some skill and experimentation, and that's where prompt engineering comes in.
Yeah.
It's all about learning how to write really good prompts.
So it's not just about what you ask, but how you ask it.
Right. It's understanding the nuances of language and how the AI model interprets things.
So you have to know how to talk to the AI in a way that it understands?
Exactly.
And it sounds like this is becoming a real skill.
It is. There are even job openings for prompt engineers now.
Wow. So there are people whose entire job is to figure out how to talk to AI.
Yeah, it's a whole new field.
That's wild. Okay, so let's talk about the elephant in the room. Can we actually trust everything these GenAI systems tell us?
That's a really important question.
Yeah, because if it's getting things wrong, that's a big problem.
Right. And honestly, even the companies that make these systems like OpenAI, they're pretty upfront about the fact that these models aren't perfect.
Okay.
They can sometimes give you wrong information, what they call hallucinations. Yeah. It's kind of a weird term, but basically it means the AI is presenting something as fact when it's not actually true.
Oh, so it's like it's making stuff up.
In a way, yes, it's not intentional, but it can happen, and they can also make logical errors.
Oh, so like it might give you a wrong answer to a math problem.
Yeah, or it might draw a wrong conclusion from a set of facts.
Okay, so we can't just blindly trust everything it tells us.
Definitely not. Critical thinking is still essential.
More important than ever, it sounds like.
I would say so.
Okay, so UNESCO is really emphasizing the need to test and evaluate these tools before we just let them loose in schools.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when it comes to education, we need to be extra careful.
So how do we do that? Like, how do we know if a GenAI tool is good or not?
Well, it depends on what the tool is supposed to do.
Okay.
Like if it's a math tutor, accuracy would be super important.
Okay.
If it's answering student questions, you'd want to know how often it gives helpful answers.
Okay.
And if it's a coding tool, you'd want to make sure the code it generates actually works.
So there needs to be like clear metrics for success.
Exactly. And those metrics will vary depending on the application.
Okay, so we've talked about the basics of GenAI and how it works. Now let's get into some of the implications for education.
Okay, sounds good.
The first thing UNESCO brings up is this idea of worsening digital poverty.
Yeah, this is a major concern.
So what does that mean exactly in the context of GenAI?
Well, it basically means that the countries and companies with the most resources are going to have a big advantage when it comes to developing and controlling this technology.
Okay, so the rich get richer, basically.
In a way, yes, because you need huge amounts of data and a lot of computing power to create and train these advanced GenAI models.
And that's something that a lot of countries, especially in the global south, just don't have.
Right, and UNESCO even uses the term data poverty to describe this.
So it's not just about having computers and internet access anymore. It's about having access to all this data.
Exactly. The data is the new gold rush.
Wow. And what's the concern there? Like, why is this a problem?
Well, one worry is that these models, which are mostly being trained in the global north, will end up reflecting those values and perspectives.
Okay.
And that could be a problem if they're then used in countries with different cultures and ways of thinking.
Right. So it's like imposing one worldview on everyone.
That's the concern, and it could lead to all sorts of unintended consequences.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so another big issue that UNESCO raises is the use of content without consent and all the complications around intellectual property rights.
Oh, yeah. This is a huge can of worms.
It really seems like the law is struggling to keep up with technology.
It is. A lot of our legal frameworks were built for a time when copying something was a much more physical process.
Right, like photocopying a book.
Exactly. But now we're talking about AIs that can generate content that's very similar to existing work, but without actually copying it directly.
And that's where the whole intellectual property debate comes in.
Right, because if an AI is trained on a data set of copyrighted works, does that mean the output it creates is also copyrighted?
It's a good question.
And who owns the copyright? The person who made the AI, the people who own the original data, it's all very murky.
So it's kind of a legal gray area right now.
It is, and there are a lot of lawsuits happening right now trying to sort it all out.
Yeah, it seems like every week there's a news story about some artist or musician suing an AI company.
It's definitely a hot topic.
Okay, so another challenge that UNESCO points to is the black box nature of these GenAI models.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah, this is a big one. The black box problem basically means that we don't fully understand how these models work internally.
Even though we built them.
Right, even though we created them. It's kind of ironic.
So how is that possible?
Well, the thing is, these models like GPT-4, they have billions, even trillions of parameters.
Okay.
Remember those little knobs and dials we talked about?
Yeah.
And these parameters interact in really complex ways that we can't easily track or understand.
So it's like we gave the AI all these tools, and it figured out how to use them in ways we don't even comprehend.
That's a good analogy.
Wow. And what are the implications of that? Like, why is it a problem that we don't fully understand how these AIs work?
Well, for one thing, it makes it hard to trust them completely. If we don't know how they're arriving at their conclusions, how can we be sure they're making good decisions?
Right, especially if we're relying on them for important things.
Exactly. And there's also the issue of bias.
Right, because if we don't know how the AI is working, we can't be sure that it's not biased in some way.
Yeah, the AI could be reflecting biases that are present in the data it was trained on.
And we might not even realize it.
Exactly. It could be very subtle.
Okay, so that's pretty concerning. So speaking of problematic content, UNESCO also talks about the pollution of the internet with AI-generated material.
Right, this is another big concern.
What do they mean by that?
Well, think about all the data that these AIs are trained on.
Okay.
It comes from the internet, right? And the internet is full of all kinds of stuff, good and bad.
Definitely a lot of bad stuff out there.
Yeah, so the worry is that these AIs are going to start generating more and more content that reflects that bad stuff.
Oh, so like fake news and misinformation.
Exactly, and also things like hate speech and biased content.
Okay, so it's not just that the AI is making stuff up, it's that it might be making up harmful stuff.
Right, and that could make it even harder to find reliable information online.
Wow, so it's like a vicious cycle.
It is, the more bad content there is, the more likely AIs are to generate even more bad content.
So UNESCO is calling this a recursive risk.
Yeah, because future AIs might be trained on this AI-generated content, and that could just amplify the problem.
Okay, so basically we're potentially creating a world where it's even harder to tell what's real and what's not.
That's the concern.
And UNESCO also uses this phrase, stochastic parrot. What's that all about?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Kind of a funny phrase.
It is. It's a way of describing these text-based AIs like GPT.
Okay.
So they can generate text that sounds really fluent and impressive, right?
Yeah, like you could write a poem or an essay that sounds like a human wrote it.
Exactly. But the thing is, they don't actually understand the meaning of the words they're using.
Oh, so it's like a parrot that can mimic human speech, but doesn't know what it's saying.
Precisely, that's the idea.
So they're just really good at pattern recognition.
Right. They're statistically predicting the next word based on all the data they've been trained on.
So it's all just probability.
In a way, yes. The term stochastic refers to that probabilistic nature.
So even though it might sound really intelligent, it might not actually make sense if you think about it too hard.
Right. It might be lacking in genuine comprehension.
Okay, so we need to be careful about taking everything these AIs say at face value.
Exactly. You can't just assume that they're reasoning the way a human would.
And that kind of leads into another issue that UNESCO talks about, which is the potential for GenAI to reduce diversity of opinions and marginalize certain voices.
Right, because these models are trained on data that reflects the dominant narratives in society.
Okay.
So the voices and perspectives of minority groups are often less represented in that data.
And that means the AI is less likely to generate content that reflects those perspectives.
Exactly. It's going to tend to reproduce the dominant viewpoints.
And that could be a problem if we're not careful.
It could, because it could lead to a narrowing of the range of ideas and perspectives that are considered valid.
Yeah, it's like the AI is reinforcing the status quo.
In a way, yes, and that's something we need to be mindful of.
Okay, and finally, UNESCO brings up a really concerning issue, the generation of deeper deepfakes.
Oh, yeah. This is where things get really scary.
Because now we're not just talking about text, we're talking about images and videos.
Right, and these GANs that we talked about earlier, they can be used to create incredibly realistic fake content.
Like those videos you see online where someone's face isn't swapped onto another person's body.
Exactly. Those are deepfakes.
And the technology is getting so good that it's almost impossible to tell the difference between real and fake.
It is. It's getting harder and harder to detect.
And that's a huge problem.
It is, because it means it's easier than ever to spread disinformation and manipulate people.
Right, because you could create a video of someone saying or doing something they never actually said or did.
Exactly. And that could have all sorts of negative consequences.
So this is something we need to be really worried about.
Absolutely. We need to be aware of the potential for harm.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of the problems and challenges that come with GenAI. So what does UNESCO propose in terms of solutions? Like, how do we regulate this stuff?
Well, UNESCO is calling for a human-centered approach to regulation.
Okay, what does that mean?
Basically, it means making sure that the development and use of AI is ethical, safe, and benefits everyone.
So it's not just about letting the tech companies do whatever they want.
Right. We need to have some rules in place to make sure things don't get out of hand.
And UNESCO has some specific recommendations for governments.
They do. They've outlined 7 key areas for action.
Okay, so number 1.
Number 1, data protection. They want governments to make sure there are strong rules in place to protect people's data.
Okay, that makes sense given how much data these AIs need.
Exactly. Number 2, national AI strategies. They want countries to develop specific plans for how they're going to use AI in a responsible way.
And that includes education specifically.
Yes, education is a big focus.
Okay, what's number 3?
Number 3, ethical regulations. They want governments to move beyond just having general principles and actually create enforceable rules about how AI can be used.
So like actual laws.
Yeah, with consequences if people break them.
Okay, number 4.
Number 4, copyright laws. They're calling for updates to copyright laws to clarify the legal status of AI-generated content.
Yeah, that's something we definitely need.
It's a big legal gray area right now.
Okay, number 5.
Number 5, data privacy for children. This is a big one. They want to make sure that kids' data is protected and that there are age limits on who can use these AI tools.
Yeah, because kids are especially vulnerable.
They are. They need extra protection.
Okay, what's number 6?
Number 6, building capacity. They want countries to invest in training and education so that people can use AI effectively and ethically.
Okay, so making sure people know how to use these tools responsibly.
Right. And finally, number 7, public debate. They want to encourage open discussions about the long-term implications of AI for society.
Okay, so getting everyone involved in the conversation.
Exactly. It's not just a matter for experts.
So those are UNESCO's recommendations for governments.
Mm-hmm.
What about other stakeholders, like the companies that are making these AI tools and the schools and universities that are using them?
So UNESCO has specific guidelines for each of those groups, too.
Okay, so let's start with the companies. What do they need to do?
Well, first and foremost, they need to take responsibility for the AI they're creating.
So not just put it out there and wash their hands of it.
Right. They need to be accountable for the potential harms as well as the benefits.
Okay.
They also need to use trustworthy data sources.
So making sure they're not using copyrighted material without permission?
Exactly. And also making sure they're not using data that's biased or discriminatory.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
They also need to work on making their AIs more transparent.
So helping us understand how they work.
Right, because remember that black box problem we talked about?
Yeah.
And they need to label AI-generated content clearly.
So we know if something was made by a human or a machine.
Exactly. And they need to be upfront about the limitations of their AIs.
So not overselling their capabilities.
Right. And they also need to take steps to prevent people from becoming addicted to these AI tools.
Addicted?
Yeah, it's a real concern.
How could someone get addicted to an AI?
Well, imagine if you had an AI that could write your essays for you or do your homework.
Oh, yeah, I guess that could be tempting.
It could, and it could lead to people becoming overly reliant on AI and neglecting their own skills.
Okay, so that's something we need to be mindful of.
Definitely. It's important to use these tools in a balanced way.
Okay, so those are the responsibilities for the companies.
Mm-hmm.
What about for schools and universities?
So for educational institutions, UNESCO recommends that they do careful audits of any AI tools they're considering using.
Okay, so like checking the algorithms and the data to make sure everything's above board.
Yep. Exactly. They also need to think carefully about whether using AI is actually the best way to achieve their educational goals.
So not just using AI for the sake of using AI.
Right. They need to make sure it's actually beneficial for the students.
Okay. And they also need to prioritize the well-being of their students.
Yes, especially children and other vulnerable groups.
And they need to keep an eye on the long-term impacts of using AI in education.
Exactly, because we don't want to end up stifling creativity or critical thinking skills.
Okay, so a lot of responsibility there for schools and universities.
Mm-hmm.
What about for individual users like teachers and students?
Well, for individuals, the key is to use AI responsibly and ethically.
Okay, so like not using it to cheat on your homework.
Exactly, or to create harmful content.
And also being aware of the potential biases that might be baked into these AI systems.
Right, and if you see something that seems wrong or illegal, you should report it.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about regulation, but UNESCO also wants to encourage the creative use of GenAI in education.
Oh, absolutely. They see a lot of potential there.
So how do we balance those two things, like regulation and creativity?
Well, it's all about finding the right approach.
Okay.
And UNESCO advocates for a human-centered and pedagogically appropriate interaction.
That's a mouthful.
It is, but it's basically about making sure that we're using AI in a way that's truly beneficial for learners.
So not just using it because it's cool or trendy.
Right. It needs to actually enhance the learning process.
And what are some of the key elements of this approach?
Well, first, we need to make sure that the use of AI is actually meeting a real need.
Okay.
Like, is it more effective or efficient than what we're already doing?
Right. Because if it's not, then why bother?
Exactly.
Okay. What else?
We also need to make sure that students are still motivated to learn.
Okay, so not just letting the AI do all the work.
Right. They need to be actively engaged in the learning process.
And we need to maintain human control over the process.
Yes. The AI should be a tool, not the teacher.
Okay. And we need to make sure the AI tools are appropriate for the student's age and level of understanding.
Absolutely. You wouldn't give a kindergartner the same AI tools as a college student.
That makes sense. So what else?
And finally, we need to make sure that the AI is being used to promote higher order thinking skills.
So not just memorizing facts, but actually analyzing and evaluating information.
Exactly. We want students to be critical thinkers, not just passive consumers of information.
And UNESCO is also a big fan of co-designing the use of GenAI in education.
Oh, yes. They think it's crucial to involve teachers, learners, and researchers in the process.
Okay, so not just letting the tech companies dictate how this technology is used.
Right. It needs to be a collaborative effort.
And they have some specific examples of how this co-design approach could work.
They do. They talk about using AI as a research advisor.
Okay.
So it could help students with things like outlining a research project, exploring data, and conducting literature reviews.
Oh, that's interesting.
But they also caution that the AI might sometimes generate fake information.
Oh, so we still need to be careful.
Absolutely. You can't just blindly trust what the AI tells you.
Okay, what other examples do they give?
They also talk about using AI as a teaching assistant.
Okay.
So it could help teachers with things like grading assignments, providing feedback to students, and even creating lesson plans.
Wow, that's a lot of potential there.
It is, but there's also the risk that the AI might reinforce existing biases.
Right, because it's been trained on data that reflects those biases.
Exactly, so we need to be aware of that.
Okay, what else?
They also talk about using AI for one-on-one coaching.
Okay.
So it could help students with things like language learning, art, or coding.
Oh, that's good.
It is, but we need to make sure that students are still getting enough real-life interaction and developing their critical thinking skills.
Right, because we don't want them to become too reliant on the AI.
Exactly.
Okay, what other examples?
They also talk about using AI in inquiry-based and project-based learning.
Okay.
So it could act as a Socratic challenger.
A Socratic challenger. What's that?
Basically, it means the AI would ask students probing questions to help them think more deeply about a topic. But again, we need to be careful that the AI isn't misleading students or preventing them from collaborating with each other.
Okay, what's the last example?
The last example is using AI to support learners with special needs.
Oh, that's a great idea.
They talk about using AI-powered accessibility tools.
Like what?
Like tools that can generate captions for videos or provide audio descriptions for images.
Oh, wow. That would be really helpful.
It would. And they also talk about using AI to create personalized learning experiences for students with different learning styles.
So it could really help level the playing field for students with disabilities.
And exactly, that's the goal. Host.